So I think we can get started, and we'll just let people trickle in as they get here. So my name is William. I'm one of the second-year psychiatry residents here at Yale. I'm one of the leaders of YPSG. We're really excited to have East Forest here with us tonight. And I'm going to turn things over to Colleen, another one of the leaders of our group, to introduce him.
Hi everybody, I'm Colleen, I'm a pharmacist over at Connecticut Mental Health Center and also help lead this group. Really happy to have you all with us today. I'm very excited today to have East Forest, who's a great musical artist. First, I heard about him on some different podcasts, Duncan Trussell podcast, heard him talk, and then as we were getting in talking about music and the importance of music and psychedelic therapy, leaning into that more, I remembered him and hearing about his music and looked back at his art and found that he recently released this album called Music for Mushrooms, and as this long 5-hour album specifically for pairing with the psychedelic experience. And I thought that he would be a great person to come and speak from his experience and contemporary perspective, in contrast to our indigenous perspectives that we had with the Kofanes a few months ago about the importance of music in psychedelic therapy. So we're really happy that he's here with us today, and he's going to talk to us about his experience and his path in this creation of music in this space, and then do a guided meditation at the end. So this is a really great one. We're really happy to have you all here today. Thanks for coming. East Forest, you can take it away.
Wow, thank you. Thank you, Colleen. Thank you, William. And hi to everybody who's here. Cool. Well, I'm excited to be here. For myself, I've always seen music as a central element in a ceremony. In some ways, I see music as a ceremony. And when I say ceremony, I can use that in the same way to look at psychedelic assisted therapy. And I thought what would be helpful is if I just give you a little background on how it is I got to be in this strange position of making music called Music for Mushrooms, and what I've sort of learned along the way anecdotally from my own experience, guiding journeys with people and being in this space of exploring how music can be used as a tool. It started 12 years ago when I was living in New York City, and I've been doing other forms of music and all the sorts of things you do in your 20s where you're trying to be famous and make it in the world. And it was 2008 when we were having that financial collapse, on the brink of it, and Occupy Wall Street was going on, and not in some ways that different than the transformational time I think we're experiencing now with the pandemic, in that it's just a very time that's very pregnant for change, and that usually happens through a form of collapse. And we often find that happens in our own lives, like meaningful change comes from other things breaking down, whether it's often from a divorce or bankruptcy or near-death experience. And in some ways you could argue we're going through a combination of all of these collectively right now. And I see that as a kind of doorway. Like we have these doorways opening in front of us, and it's our choice how we want to walk through them. So back when it was happening externally in the world in 2008, it was also happening for me internally in my life. And I think I just finally broke down the need to follow those other systems where I was really trying to make it and have that external validation. And I just started making music that was for me. And I had no plan to sell it or have any real commercial agenda with it. And I had, like many people that I know, maybe I've had an experience or two with psychedelics that were profound, but I didn't understand it. I didn't have anyone to explain it to me. I didn't have any elders in my life. I was lucky that it was positive. But there was something that happened in those experiences, or I experienced something, a felt experience that was almost more real than real. And it touched on something that I felt like I've been yearning for in the background of just life. And I wanted to return to that. And in some of those experiences, music had played a really important role in how they wove together in the moment, like how the music and that actual experience in the psychedelic experience at its apex combined. And so as a musician, I thought I would try to make music that could maybe direct me into that field, into that space again more reliably. So I started looking into what was out there about modern sound healing science, which is mostly about things like entraining the brain and relaxation, and the few studies that are out there, and just what people are doing with binaural beats, or different forms of different tunings, or essentially overtones in general, and what that does to calm us down. And then also looking at what had been done indigenously for thousands of years. And the best way to experience that was to go to some of these ceremonies, like a Lakota sweat lodge, for instance. I went to a few of those, and they're explaining to me that the ceremony is a form of technology that is extremely strict, in that the purpose of that is so that it doesn't change over the years, that it won't morph through small changes over hundreds and then thousands of years into a completely different piece of technology. And so you really get to see like what others have learned has been working for them. And whether it was a San Pedro ceremony at Machu Picchu, or ayahuasca ceremonies in Peru, or these Lakota sweat lodges, or other forms of indigenous ceremony, you quickly realize that for almost all of them, if not all of them, music is the essential vehicle within the ceremony. And then beyond that, you can start to look at it from sort of a music perspective. There are certain common threads going on, and I'm combining that with what I was learning about what we know about the brain and music from a modern perspective. I'm seeing how a rattle or a drum, how that starts to entrain the brain, just from a traditional shamanic experience with no medicine. You often just use a drum, and it's a way of essentially entraining your brain and getting into trance states, more receptive states, hypnotic states, where we can start to access these other layers of our consciousness. So putting all this together, mostly in an artistic way, I just started making music that was really chasing a particular feeling for me. And I did this over the course of a year, and I made what became an album, and I just played it for myself. And because it was inspired by psilocybin, I took some psilocybin in a little ceremony in my bedroom in Brooklyn, and said, just to say like, okay, I want to kind of bookend this experience. And I had this incredible experience listening to that album, because it was so touching, primarily because I had started doing these field recordings. So simultaneously, I was also getting really turned on by nature, and I went up to the Adirondacks, which was 6 hours north, and I would go backpacking, which I hadn't done since Boy Scouts. And I was getting, oh my God, like wilderness. This is turning on, and the same feeling in me. So I was recording these landscapes and weaving it into the music, but also recording things in New York City and in my life. And so when I listened to the record, I was listening to the everywhere I'd been for the last year. My mother was in there, the places I'd hiked to, the places in New York City, all kind of mashing together. And there was just like this poignancy and synchronicity to it that was, it was just so profound. And it felt like this life-changing moment that I can't really explain to you, but it felt like that was enough. It was meaningful enough for me that that was enough, like that whole process. But when I gave the album to a few friends, they started having powerful experiences in a similar way. And then one of my friends, who is one of those producers in New York, who just gets things done, he started organizing circles and just saying, like, you're going to lead a circle, and we're going to use this album. And I said, I don't know how to do this. I don't. And he says, don't worry about it. It's on Saturday. We'll figure it out. And so he basically pushed me into these things, and we just started doing it. And the central guide for us, a North Star, was, how do we guide people through a psychedelic journey so that it's safe and it's powerfully positive for them? That was it. And my main mechanism by doing that was to use music, and to use a kind of protocol that's a ritualistic ceremonial structure that's not complicated, but it's all about that set in the setting, and how do we make that intentional and so people feel safe. But the music was the main vehicle. And so I just had to learn through trial and error, and what I'd picked up from the other ceremonies and what I'd read about, musical techniques. And that's why I started live looping and creating these sort of longer soundscapes and weaving in the field recordings. And over 4 or 5, 6 years of doing this, I was creating a musical language, this kind of sonic lexicon that became unique to me because I was doing it for a very specific purpose, for psilocybin journeys. And I just started to learn some of the things that worked and what didn't work, and what helped people have a really positive experience more reliably. Um, and so that's how I kind of came to doing this as East Forest. And I didn't really start making it a public thing until probably 2015. And then I started feeling the need to share it outside these private circles more widely. And I didn't think that it would have any interest out there, because it was these long form, ambient, difficult to describe what genre it was in, psilocybin music. And this is back when this is not as trendy. You know, this was still, I never would have thought conversations like this would be happening, let alone books like Michael Pollan's, or all the other things that are cascading forward in our society right now as these cultural winds are really taking off. So let me just tell you a little bit about, in the second part of this, what I learned and what I started to implement into this music, because maybe that would be interesting for you. I noticed when certain playlists were being shared by like Johns Hopkins, or NYU, or there's a few others that there weren't many. There's a few more now. Um, I personally wasn't that satisfied with them. And instead of just complaining about that, I thought I would offer a solution. And that's what sort of pushed me forward into releasing Music for Mushrooms, a soundtrack for the Psychedelic Practitioner. And I gave it that specific long title so people would know exactly what it was for, a soundtrack for the Psychedelic Practitioner, whether that's an individual or someone who's leading a person or groups. I saw this almost as a digital shaman. I don't see myself as a shaman, but I saw it sort of as I say that sort of tongue in cheek, as a way of, what's the most reliable way to guide them? And I was like, if you get the music part, I think you're covering 75% of it. And then if you get the ceremony and the protocol, which is simple, you're now up to 95%. And those are the two things missing largely from a lot of the clinical studies. Now, on my own podcast, I've talked to and I've met a lot of people who work in these studies in these institutions. And from what I can tell, they're all coming from a really good-hearted place where they've actually had some pretty profound experiences themselves. And they know sort of the role that plays in a result. But I know those things are difficult to quantify. And music is this intangible thing that it's very difficult to nail that down inside a study to say, how do we keep that variable consistent so we can study it? And I get that that's really hard. And one of the maybe infuriating things about like this conversation today is I can't tell you like, oh, if you do these 5 things, or if the musician does these things, it'll work. It's an art, like, and it always has been and always will be. Now there are certain elements that seem to help, but you also could not use any of those, because music is also a matter of taste, right? We've learned that different people like different things. And so you can't play classical music for sure and have that work, which is the first thing that was being used in a lot of the studies, as I'm sure you guys know, which to me personally would be like the worst thing you could play, not because I dislike classical music, but because it feels fairly rigid unless it's like Bach or Debussy or something. So I saw these playlists and I saw this lack of sort of ceremony and ritual inside what the offerings were. And I thought like, we need to kind of combine them in some way, because I saw music being the ceremony itself. So some of the things that I was combining in, as I said, I was trying to blend these ancient indigenous sound techniques that we could experience anecdotally or in person or read about or talk about. Some of those things like the repetitive drums, the loop percussive phrasing, the things that help and train the brain, and some of the more creative that I experienced with particular shamans, like the way they would essentially perform or what type of music they would play, or even how the breaks between the music, and the modern day sound healing ideas, like the alternative tunings, overtones, and even the use of software like Ableton Live, which I was using as sort of like a mixer, and to launch my field recording clips inside the ceremony. And then also experimenting with like biofeedback technology with certain groups and institutions to think about things like taking into the future of what would it mean if it's dynamic and generative music that's inside an app or a program, and that it's responding to your own biofeedback, whether it's emotional response or your heart rate or your breathing or whatever. And that is essentially, it's like AI, it's an AI shaman essentially guiding you through the journey, which is a wild idea. But this is already being started by, Wavepaths, as I composed for them. They're starting to look at some of this stuff. And there are many other companies that are less in the psychedelic space, but thinking about generative dynamic music in that way. So, some of the things that work for me in using music to guide a journey is that it's the music guiding it, not words. So it's typically instrumental music, and it's a connected experience from start to finish. Like we're never really dropping the ball of sound. And I think about music as sound, and I think about the other polarity of that being noise. So how can we essentially calm down the noise in our own nervous system and in our minds and in our hearts so that we can reach those more tender aspects of our psyche, our soul, whatever you want to call it, to, as I contend, to plant seeds of choice, to say like, okay, I've had this experience, things have been illuminated in a way, and now I'm making choices about how I want to go forward. So I want to create a connected experience of music. So there's that. And playlists essentially, on the face of it, do that. But none of the music in the playlists that are currently out there, as far as I know, none of the music was specifically written for the psychedelic journey, let alone psilocybin. It's all sort of being used off label. And some of this music is beautiful music. And it's not to say it won't work in a journey, right? We've had impressive results from a lot of the major studies from classical music or music that maybe people didn't even like, or all sorts of music. So again, there's not one answer, but I think there's a difference when you're creating music that it's more like a tool and it's designed for this experience. So when I also weave in the nature and the wilderness field recordings, I think most people know that psilocybin is particularly good in nature. A lot of, like most people that I would talk to who are coming into a ceremony, 99% of them had never sat in ceremony, meaning never like been still and created a ceremonial container for psilocybin. And most of them had done it outdoors. No judgment to either. That was just kind of the experience they were coming with. And so it's kind of like we're bringing that power of the wilderness and the nature into the sound, because we're doing these experiences largely in the dark, in a circle, in a group. So it's about listening. It's about feeling. It's about opening. And these original field recordings I was really into like places that are still wild, meaning places that are still wilderness. And I felt that they contain a special energy that definitely can get translated by the sound of it. And it unlocks something about that wilderness in ourselves, remembering that we are nature, walking and talking with eyes and ears. We are not separate from it, but we feel very separate from the natural world more and more every year. And you could contend that feeling of separateness is what causes a lot of our feelings of depression and anxiety, perhaps even addiction and polarization and so forth. So anything we can do to feel more inclusive to the world around us and everyone around us, all life around us, not just human beings, this naturally happens as a form of empathy on a lot of psychedelics, particularly psilocybin. And so weaving that into the music brings a kind of solace. And anything we can do to calm the nervous system down, to create that receptiveness and that openness is going to help people to walk through this experience so it can be gentle but powerful. We're not trying to like anesthetize them with, you don't want to all just be calm. But on that note, I would also bring in elements of tension and release. Now, this is in a lot of music, but I'm doing this in a very long form way. So, you're setting up songs that might be 30 minutes, 30 minutes. And this is good because it gives the song becomes like a sonic architecture that you are inside the peak of a journey. I mean, when you're really in that medicine, you're literally in this architecture of that sound, especially when your eyes aren't is that sense is turned off. And so if you have enough time where it builds slowly and it gets somewhere and it travels in there and then it goes away slowly, you have time to explore that space and explore what's coming up in your psyche in that experience. A lot of these other songs in the playlist, they're shorter. And each one of those might not allow enough time for you to go on the journey you need to go through. That's sort of like the chapter that you're going through of the book of this journey. And in each one of those chapters, it's good to have sort of a tension that builds, and then we create a release, and that seems to be followed in the emotional experience. And really, this is mirroring how we go through life. It's sort of a dualistic way of thinking about on, off, breath out, breath in. It's natural, right? It's a way of regulating breath too, in a sense. And that's all I ever ask people to do is I say, you're really just here to listen and to breathe. And when we do our little meditation at the end, it's the same thing. And it's profound, like how far we can go with just that. And then amongst having these chapters, I found it was really powerful to have breaks. And in the breaks, I typically would have a field recording playing. So the sound is still there, but now it's like a babbling brook, or it's like these crickets on the top of a mountain, or a breeze going through fall leaves from the Adirondacks or the Catskills. And so you have this, and this is something I picked up in most indigenous ceremonies. They always had this time. It was like we're time rich. We didn't need to rush to the next song. It's like the Ikaros ends, and then there was like this beautiful space right here, the bugs and the things around me. And then it's like, that became like a chapter in itself of repose. And just a side note about ayahuasca. If you think about how ayahuasca came into the Western world, it came with the ceremony intact. I've only a few times in my life seen people using ayahuasca relatively recreationally, and that's extremely rare. It's almost always inside like Santo Daime or a Peruvian style or some kind of South American style ceremony, and for good reason. But I think that's somewhat interesting because mushrooms is very different. It has not retained a ceremonial container in the Western world, and most people, as I said earlier, have never thought about using it intentionally or in a ceremonial container. They've used it in ways that are still often powerful for them, or they stumbled into that perfunctory nature and infinite feelings of it, which is amazing. But most people, they don't know, like, well, how would I create a ceremony around this? And so that sort of Western new shamanic tradition is what I wanted to build. And I wanted to build that largely through music and teaching about the role of ceremony. Because going back to telling you what are the elements inside the music for mushrooms or East Forest music that's helping guide a journey, it's also that it's using elements that are familiar to our Western ear, like the instrumentation of pianos and Fender Rhodes and vocals, the field recordings themselves. These are not things that your brain hasn't heard before. So it creates a kind of familiarity. Even the harmonic structure I'm using are things that are parts of Western music. There's nothing wrong with like a Peruvian rattle going to, and I've been in ceremonies, that was all there was. And it was intense. It was amazing, but it was stark. And there's nothing wrong with the beauty of Ikaros, which many ayahuasqueros say is the medicine. It's calling forth literally the medicine. And without the songs, you can't just take the medicine. You wouldn't have the spirit of ayahuasca coming forth. And so we needed to find a way to, like, how could we build a ceremony that's reliable for Westerners, that's respecting these traditions, but also trying to pull it together so it makes the most sense for us in a reliable way. And the last thing is that when I recorded these albums, I did them inside ceremonies. And when I'm playing inside ceremonies, I'm improvising. And I'm doing that because I personally don't see it as a performance. I'm not there to entertain or distract. I'm there at best, and this is a bit metaphysical, but to allow something larger to come through. And for me, it's to be a vehicle through that. And that is more successful sometimes than others. But that space, I'm giving myself over to something. And at its best, you get into these flow states where something is birthed in the moment, is what you're hearing in the recording. And then it's never played again, because you would have to listen to the recording to essentially relearn what happened in that moment. And you're also responding to what's happening in the room energetically. And you're kind of in yourself, you're following the arc and the flow that the medicine takes, in this case, psilocybin, in a 4, 5, 6 hour journey for people. So these are some of the things that are some of the elements I'm weaving into the music specifically. But beyond that, it's unfortunately intangible. And there's a lot of groups reaching out to me these days, and I'm having a lot of conversations about, hey, we need music for this app or this ketamine clinic or this psilocybin thing. And I get it. It's because there's really not any clear leadership out there, and it's a little bit of the Wild West on what do we do and what works. And for a lot of people, they're not musicians, they're certainly not musicologists, and even if they were, they probably weren't trained or have any specific knowledge about what would work inside psilocybin therapy. A lot of it is trial and error right now. I'm biased, and I really believe in the offerings I put out there, and I'm actually going to put out a few more. But they're pretty labor intensive to create. But I've seen already, by digitizing it essentially and putting it out into the world, where it's no longer something that I'm controlling, and allowing people to be essentially inspired by the sense of creating ceremony around a journey, but then giving them a very specific tool. They're having reliable, beautiful experiences. I'm hearing about its use with therapists, individuals, research, and it's really just there to be a guide. And I want it to say, look, it's been 12 years that we've been experimenting on our own in the underground. I thought it would be useful to share what we've learned in our circle, in our little community, of what's working and what's working from a musical standpoint, and how powerful music can be as a tool and the central element of a ceremony, and in how many ways it is a ceremony. And so it's a big blind spot, in my opinion, but I also think people are waking up to the importance of paying attention to it. And there's people like Mendel Kaling at Wavepaths, when he was working with Robin Carhart Harris at Imperial College, he was studying this, but there weren't, as far as I know, many other people doing those kind of studies. So I think it's a very nascent form of science right now, and we've got a ways to go. But it's also like asking a fish what water is. Music is so ever present in our lives and in the world right now, more than it ever has been in the history of humanity, that we don't fully recognize the role that it and sound plays in our lives, and how dramatically it changes our consciousness and can direct our consciousness, and how we're already using it by dialing up certain sounds or trying to find calmer, quieter places, or conversely, how we're not, and how we're feeling distracted or feeling our cortisol levels are being jacked up because maybe it's too noisy. And Gordon Hempton, a sound recordist, describes noise as silence as the absence of noise, not the absence of sound. And I think we're talking about how to cultivate a kind of silence inside the psychedelic journey, and that's done through music. And I think there's a poetry to that I really like. So I'm going to leave it there for now. That's a lot of talking, and maybe we could just open up to more of a conversation and see where it goes from there.
Yeah, so if anybody has some questions, you can use the raise hand function, or you can ask some questions in the chat. I'll start it off with a question that I have, where there's like a difference between, or can you kind of describe what would be the difference in like having a dynamic type musical experience where you are responding to the experience of a person versus just having a like a music that you're playing, and how that might affect someone. And obviously not all situations it's going to be feasible to have live music where it can be dynamic, but I don't know, I feel like sometimes that can be really powerful too, just being able to respond, like you were saying, directly to what's going on in the room, and where you think that might fit in the future with these therapies and stuff.
Yeah, that's a great question. As far as being a guide or a sitter or facilitator, I think I'm probably in the Terrence McKenna camp. That's like, the less you do, the better. And he had that great anecdote. Like, he's like, all he needed in a sitter was someone who's in the other room, and he would just ring a little bell when he needed them, and they would just pop their head in and just say, everything's cool. And then they'd leave. I think a lot of people tend to do too much. And now when we go back to saying how important music is, basically, and how powerful it is to change the experience you're having, if someone makes the wrong decision, I shouldn't say wrong, let's say less educated decision, or it's just sort of a buzzkill, party kill on the DJ playlist, you know, it can really change things. It's a powerful tool. And so I do agree that at your best, you are reading the experience, and you can steer it with music. But I think most people would change things too soon. You know, it's like maybe you need to write out a certain experience, for instance. And if anything, what would almost be a more powerful layer to add in is not necessarily changing the music, but having them add in their own toning or singing to the music, or your own singing and toning, because it's a great way when you're having a challenging journey or you're working with someone, is to have them sing, particularly a song they know, even just like Happy Birthday or Twinkle Twinkle Little Star, because it regulates their breath. The vibrations in their body are quite pleasurable. It gives them something to focus on mentally. But singing is something we all can do. And particularly in a journey, you know, creating music for someone else to experience, the only thing that matters is not your technical prowess. It's, is it coming from your heart? Is it authentic, and is it genuine? That's it. So we actually all have the ability to guide it, even if we wanted to, with our own musical abilities. But a lot of us don't have that, and a lot of us don't have the experience to judge, like, you know, I should change to this music now. So if you don't, I had this same question myself when I released the Music for Mushrooms album, because I thought, like, well, but I've always done it in a way that I am the one in the room shifting it just based on my intuition and what I'm reading. But it's turned out that it still seems to be a very positive and powerful tool for people. So just from the beta testing out there over the last few years, you can trust in that. You can trust in sort of a collective arc, a collective journey there. And if as we start to get more tracks that feel reliable to you, and I'm pretty picky about that, but you could have your little library. You don't need a big one. You could have tracks that maybe create a bit more tension or excitement versus tracks that are more calming, but don't move too soon. And I also have friends I have a friend who does hip hop psilocybin circles, and he does like ceremonies with hip hop music because that speaks to his community. And I say, that's fantastic. You know, it's really just like, we need to meet people where they're at and a language they're at. And I was just trying to do that for myself. And I found that there's enough other people that it spoke to them too, but there's definitely not one way to do it.
That's a great tip. Thank you. I'm gonna call on Brady right now. So.
Hi, really enjoying your talk so far. Thank you for showing up. I have a question that's sort of related to a previous seminar we had with an author, Brian Morarscu. I'm not entirely sure how to pronounce his last name. It's Greek, I think. You'll have to forgive me. Anyhow, essentially, he is a researcher that looks into the mystery of Eleusis and the potential psychedelic hypothesis in ancient Greece. And during that talk, one of the attendants mentioned that there was a trip report from somebody on Datura who had this experience where they met this entity that had these certain characteristics, and the whole conversation ground to a halt because the Brian was like, what do you mean? Can you go into that? And they basically described almost word for word similar experiences that the ancient Greeks have when they were interacting with the particular goddess that they think that they were interacting with. So my sort of long-winded question is, in all of your extended experiences with this, have you come across any cross-cultural reports of what might be loosely categorized as a transcultural disembodied consciousness?
The last thing you said cut out, but I'm gonna.
Yeah, I think you got the gist of it. I'm sorry, I accidentally muted myself. I apologize.
That's okay. The answer is sort of. One thing I've always noticed with hypnosis is a great analogy with psychedelic experiences, is that it's coming through the filter of our own consciousness and our own personality. If you think about it, coming from the ground up, from all the layers of our consciousness and out through the top levels of even our language centers and coming out, some people, their visions, they might have a Christian background and they see Jesus, or someone else might see a panther in the jungle, or someone else might not see anything, but it's more about their family and relationships there, or with none of the above. My point making that the visions and the experiences those have, it's sort of like dreams in a way. We take them as metaphor for me. And I see common threads, but we always, just like dreams, sometimes there's some gobbledygook in there. You don't want to take the whole thing too seriously, but you also want to pay attention to the threads of meaning that are in there for you. And as many of us know, one of the challenging things about journeys is that they're ineffable. They transcend. They're like another octave of consciousness. Like this piano over here has 88 keys and a certain number of octaves. You're up there off the keys in the journey. And when you're in that space, it makes sense. But when you come, and then you say, I have the answer, and you put it on a piece of paper, and then you come back and it's just like a circle, and unfortunately no one else says, yeah, buddy, nice circle. And you're like, no, but that's the answer. It was, I can't explain it anymore. I can only answer the question with more like metaphor. But I think that's why music is perfect and why the mystic poetry exists, because that is the only way to talk about the mystery. Eric Davis, techno philosopher, he said, the mystery has no edge. And it's sort of like a Buddhist koan in a way. And I love that, because it's a way of saying, like, yeah, we always want to put our finger on it, but you never will be able to. But that's the mind doing its job to create the compartmentalization to keep us safe. But something about the psychedelic experience takes us into the ineffable, into the numinous, where we go beyond these limitations, like the operating system that we're running in this spacesuit of our body and our brain now got an upgrade, and we're able to experience consciousness in ways we couldn't before, but it's temporary. And I think those sorts of felt experiences are really, really, really important, but there's a reason why we come back. And there's a reason, in my view, why we're here. We're here to do the work of walking the walk of our lives. There's, to do exactly what here we are. So they're there to give you insight and glimpses and inspiration. But you could look at it also from the analogy. I look at my dog, who has its frame of consciousness, and I can't explain to the dog my frame of consciousness, my octave. It's on a different part of the piano it doesn't have. But it's almost like maybe there's a psychedelic you can give to the dog, and it suddenly understands what it means to be a human, and it has this whole journey, and it goes back to being a dog, and it wants to tell its dog friends and everyone, okay, what did you learn? What's the big message? And all it can say is woof, and it's like, that's just like the same thing you said before. He's like, but it's not. And so it's just a very roundabout way with your question to say that I have heard all sorts of stories, and you could look at it that like you're opening up your body as an antenna. That's another model to think about it. And so now you've turned a dial, so the bandwidth of what you're able to experience is bigger. And when you do that, perhaps there is psychic noise, energetic noise, dimensional noise, things that are unexplained yet. Perhaps. Whether these are in your own consciousness, you know, we're truly experiencing like just the fractal, infinite, amazing nature of our brains, or these are actual beings and entities that are all in different dimensional places around us, and we're interacting. They're taking advantage of us, and we have sometimes these sort of side journeys where people haven't done the work to clear the space around them, or there's no one to help them in that way, and people get delusional. I mean, I've met a lot of people just in modern psychedelic circles that are delusional, self-importance, self-aggrandizement. These are not panaceas. And so we look back in history at the stories that have been told, and we have to remember to take them with a grain of salt, in a sense, and as metaphor, because particularly in the past, and probably with the Greeks, we don't know, but it was probably that there was some sort of ergot-based psychedelic that they were taking that they deemed only they should take because they were the educated or the smart or the priest class, and they would disseminate it to everybody else. It's not allowed or not for everybody else. And I think the big shift these days, probably since, you know, the summer of love in the 60s, and particularly now, is that this is open for us. This is open for anybody for direct experience. And I think about Thich Nhat Hanh saying that the next Buddha may be the community, it may be the Sangha, meaning that it's not about another guru, another Jesus, it's about us and recognizing our individual power. Or Duncan Trussell, you mentioned, Colleen, he said, you know, maybe the Messiah will be a meme, which is sort of a fun thought. And so that's my long metaphoric answer, Brady, to say that it's possible that people too have their own delusions about that, but at the same time, there are threads of connection amongst cultures that you definitely see over time. We have to interpret it, so it's challenging.
Awesome, thank you. I'll throw out a question. So it's been said about like writing that you can learn as much from bad writing as from good writing. So I was wondering if you could, you know, point out some things that you've noticed over your journey of, you know, parts of music or approaches that don't work, and then where you've had negative results, where you've seen other people have negative results, things to avoid, stuff like that.
Yeah, it's a good question. The biggest thing is the intentionality of where the music is coming from. And I think I was touching on that before. I've noticed for myself, if there's any kind of pandering, like you're trying to give people what you think they want, or in the journey, you're trying to come from the outside in and say, oh, you know, there's any sort of performative aspect of I am playing the shaman, or I'm supposed to do this rattle thing, or I'm supposed to play crystal bowls, or whatever it is, as opposed to you've done the work as a musician, so you can play, you know, it's sort of like a rehearsing as an actor. It's like, I've learned the lines, now I can forget them so I can be here in the moment. You've done the rehearsal, so now I can just be here in this space. And it's more important to follow your own inner intuition about what excites you. It's like a mirror, like it's a sort of Joseph Campbell way of following your own bliss. And so I found that if I'm really just singing from the heart, in essence, that's the most important thing. That is the North Star. And it goes way back to when I very first started this whole thing with that first record I made. It was just for me. And I was doing it with no intention to do anything else and I was chasing just a feeling of that I'd felt before. That was it. And when I did that, it worked, and it became this really powerful thing for me. And the 10 years prior, where I was trying to be a famous this or that, a musician, and be in bands and do the whole thing, nobody cared because all we need and all we want, all I want, is to witness other authenticity and other human beings speaking from the inside out, from a place of truth, because we all want to witness that same truth in one another. And particularly today, when everything's so digital and ephemeral and we're so connected, I just feel we're missing out on that humanness, that basic sort of holding up the mirror to one another and really witnessing one another. And it's a very powerful, simple gift we give to each other that is in short supply. And so musically, it's really just about, it's coming from your own center, and that we all have that. And so in ayahuasca circles, sometimes they would open up the floor near the end of the journey and let other people perform. And I always remember, like, most people weren't performing very well, but it was like it would bring me to tears, the beauty, because it was just like there was just like I felt like, oh, it's a real person really singing, maybe for the first time, and it was so beautiful, and all of my judgment was gone, and so I think it's sort of that humbleness and that groundedness can go a long way.
Thank you. So next, Andre Faria.
Hello. Hi. Thank you so much for this. This has been so great so far. I had a question in particular about vocalists and like vocals inside of music. I noticed that a lot of the music that's used for like psychedelic therapy of sorts will typically not have any vocalists in it. But you were saying earlier how singing with like people who are going through using the medicine has been like very useful, and like can help them like calm down or like whatever the situation is. And I wanted to ask, like, what are the limitations of vocalists? Like, would you recommend that the music be in a language that people don't understand, or in no language at all, like nonsense? Or like, is there a use to like lyrical messages?
Yes, great question. I did not specify before that. I think it's best to kind of keep those language centers of our brain quiet, and if you do have any words, they're amplified in a way. So it would be better to have, maybe that's a great idea, like music in a language the person doesn't know, because it's essentially just sound. And the music that I do some vocals, but I do kind of vocalization that it's not English. My girlfriend jokes that we call it language light, because it's kind of sort of like language, and I'm just sort of improvising in the moment, just like with the music. But I started doing that several years back, because just like you were picking up on, uh, the voice is so powerful. It's a breath instrument. It's what makes, it's like the snowflake of each person, but overtones are really where it's at with the kind of music, like what turns people on the most, period, but definitely in the psychedelic space, is overtones. So everything has overtones, but some instruments have more. So if you think about a gong or a Tibetan bowl, what you're hearing there are lots of layers of overtones with a very long, rich sustain. So it's just sort of like overtone to the max. And, when I would put a Tibetan bowl on someone, on their heart, and give that a gong at the peak of a plateau, it's like their heart explodes. I mean, it's so beautiful and so powerful. And you can put this into the recordings, which I did, but there's nothing like feeling the vibration on your body, because you have to remember, music is a physical sensation. There are pressure waves impacting your body. When you hear bass, you feel it in your body, and the higher frequencies, you feel them too, just in more subtle ways. So it is a physical process. And that's another little side note, for anyone who's a therapist, to thinking about the difference between headphones and speakers in the room with like a subwoofer. The quality of the sound system, if you're for recorded music, is incredibly important. Please do not diminish even just having a wave file of high fidelity versus a bad MP3. It will translate. You might not understand what that means, but you could have a PhD in music or know absolutely nothing, and both of our bodies will respond emotionally to the same kind of music. It's baked into our DNA how we respond emotionally to music. So if you remember that it just is these pressure waves, the thing that's producing the quality of those waves will create a better experience for that person, especially when you think about ear fatigue over a longer period of time. Meaning, if it's higher quality earphones and a higher fidelity sample that you're playing, they'll be able to last longer without feeling that kind of brittleness or physical stress, essentially, from a lower quality MP3 or bad headphones and stuff. So, but the voice has a lot of overtones. And that's why I think the singer has gone across time as something that we latch onto and adore and love to hear, because it is a spell. It is powerful. So I think finding music that doesn't have lyrics but vocals that's still good, good luck finding that, is a great thing to have and a great thing to use. And it's something that I put into my music.
Awesome. Thank you for that answer. Next question comes from Jacob Van Houten.
Thank you. I've really enjoyed this this presentation so far. This is kind of a personal interest question. I've asked several researchers, but never anyone really in the music space. Have you had any experience with individuals who have synesthesia, or they get their senses crossed, and them having an experience in a ceremony with you? And do those tend to be good experiences?
This is a pretty short answer. I mean, yeah, when people get into psychedelic spaces, synesthetic responses are somewhat common, and it may not be something they've ever experienced before. And I think for most people that is pleasurable. And it's sort of in the way that I said music is a sonic architecture, like the room that you're in. In some ways, the music can take on very visual and physical aspects of the experience that you're inhabiting. So yeah, that can be quite common and usually considered interesting and
A
exciting.
clarification on that question was, you meant synesthesia you're born with?
Oh, if yeah, only a couple times, and they did not, it's only a couple people, but they didn't find that to be a problem. It just continued in a really amplified way in the experience along with other things. And I should say that, I've discovered that I created a smaller versions of the Music for Mushrooms album called Spores. That's an hour, and it's kind of like a highlights reel. But it turns out my partner is a ketamine therapist, and she's been using it a lot in ketamine therapy and finding that it works really well to guide that. And actually the shorter songs are almost better for that kind of timeline of a journey. But the other constituent parts of the music still work really well. And she's a DJ herself, so she's very well versed in music, but not finding that a lot of other music is really kind of working in the same way. But it's a resource I could provide you guys too. She's created some playlists that include a lot of my music, but a little bit of some other stuff. And every time she lists that she has playlists for ketamine therapy, and she always has like 100 requests being like, can you share them with me too? I need music. I don't know what to do. I don't know what to use. And so that's just a little side note about, it's not just for psilocybin. That just happened to be where I was coming from.
All right, great. Our next question comes from Court Wing.
Hey, Court. I think you're muted.
Hey there. Sorry, I had to unmute. Thanks so much for sharing this time with us. I'm really curious, when you're going through your music selection, with all your research, do any type of considerations for things like tonal topic mapping, or maybe you mentioned kind of singing and humming? And right now, polyvagal theory is kind of making the rounds, and like I know that humming or singing or intoning tend to promote a lot of stimulus through, like, say, cranial nerves, like 9 and 10, vagus, glossopharyngeal stuff. Is that ever entering your consideration? I mean, I'm also thinking of ancestral knowledge. With the heavy drum beats, that's going to hit different receptor levels through the ground. Is that type of stuff ever kind of entering, let's say, your calculus?
Yeah, a little bit. I definitely think you're nailing it, that going back to singing again, or really toning and humming. I mean, who can't hum? Humming is a really easy thing to do. It doesn't take a lot of energy, and it does stimulate nerves, and it is calming. There are some studies on that, but these are
very parasympathetic.
Yes, exactly. And so I think it's a fantastic thing to bring into a simple protocol, or at some point in the journey. The drumming and things like that, I've found, for me, work best at the beginning. And it's a kind of way of sort of calling forth the energy, but also started to entrain the brain and sort of help with that challenging transition from really this consciousness as that first hour to kind of break through can be tough. And at times you really need something to keep a through line with that. And often a kind of rhythm can be helpful there. There's no definite rules, but I found that for myself. And in some traditional shamanic ceremonies, they bookend it in the same way. It's sort of like bringing you out, bringing you back. But I think there'll probably be more research in the next decade about some of the things you're bringing up and like what actually works. Because for me, I can just say like, I play around with this stuff, but I haven't ever like wired people up. I'm just sort of putting it all together in an artistic soup, and really it's my own intuition vibing like what I think will work. But I think toning and singing is a huge part of it. I really do. And I think we underestimate that anyway, because we now pay people to sing for us essentially. Right? We forget that this is our own birth.
It was interesting that you mentioned like kind of the difference between silence and noise, because that sounds very similar to Qualia Research Institute's ideas about valence and dissonance, and like one has symmetry versus one is asymmetrical and not resonant. So I really appreciate what you're saying today. Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, you could go down the rabbit hole of temperaments too, and if anyone gets super nerdy on music, but it's actually amazing if you think about it. If you just think about the most basic level, you know, music is relationships of ratios, and a fifth, you know, a C to a G on a piano or whatever the fifth is think of it as like a shape. It's just math, right? It's either exactly right or it's not, and that's like it's more in harmony or it's less. And long story short, the way we've done a lot of Western temperaments, a lot of things are slightly out, and that's not necessarily bad. It's just creating a little bit of that dissonance. I mean, also distortion in music. A lot of people like that. It makes things sound really vibey, but it's just something to think about. Like when we're bringing in, you know, the human voice, if someone has a good ear, naturally, when you're harmonizing with someone, or a string player that doesn't have frets, they can just do this naturally to create that kind of perfect intonation. Whereas a lot of Western music is not like that. And that's why I would play with different tunings and things like that. Really sort of like the Beatles and Jimi Hendrix tuning their guitars down just to get outside the box and to create, we're already just a little bit outside of what our brain is used to hearing, sort of in this conventional A being 440 all the time and everything's perfect. It's like we need to have that sense of imperfection and flow, because that is a very natural state. That is nature. The human voice is naturally going to bring that because it's not perfect. So keeping those human elements and those natural instrument elements is important, because I think it resonates quite literally with the parts of our humanity that is not perfect.
Awesome. Thank you.
Thanks. I'm gonna I don't want to neglect some of the questions in the chat. So there's one here. Have you ever considered exploring music that would be therapeutic for those vibrating in mania and psychosis, a frequency of sound that could help get their egos back into a state of cohesive flow? As a psychiatrist, this is something I often wonder about, and I'm sure a lot of us here wonder about this.
I've only had experiences with that when people are kind of essentially experiencing almost a psychotic break inside, you know, a journey, or just a really challenging space that's probably not that different than schizophrenic states in a journey. So we know it's going to be temporary, but it's still quite uncomfortable for them. And my tact has always been to really feel like the captain of the ship. It's like, okay, we're in a storm. I'll keep my hand on the wheel, and like I'll keep that grounding and that through line with the music. And I might do things with the music that are more grounding, or I bring in. I won't like push ourselves into like strange dissonance or strange tension. It's more like soothing and grounding and pulsing. But I would be really interested if someone were to experiment with this, because I hope this isn't a terrible analogy, but like I realized that music was really great for dogs, some of my music. And someone did some basic research about how dogs are like really simple melodies and it's calming for them. And it's like, well, I didn't write the music for dogs, but turns out certain songs, if I make a playlist of my songs, it's very calming, and the dogs often go to sleep and they have less anxiety. So it may be that some of these core characteristics about what takes people through the psychedelic journey that can at times mimic mania and maybe even be similar aspects of our brain firing, perhaps could work for people who are experiencing those states. But truth is, I don't have any personal experience with that, but I'm very interested in it.
Awesome. All right, next question comes from Jordan.
Hi, good evening. Thanks so much for joining us. I wanted to ask a little bit, we've had a lot of conversations about diversity and psychedelic therapy. And I guess my question is asking you your thoughts about cultural adaptation of music playlists, especially, I think you mentioned the Hopkins playlist mostly, is kind of a lot of the criticisms of some of the playlists are that they were sort of pretty Western, white-centric, and in thinking about expanding psychedelic therapies to people from diverse backgrounds and ethnic backgrounds. I'm just wondering if you think about how to adapt music to folks with different backgrounds.
Absolutely. I think the question you're really talking about is about accessibility and inclusivity. And that's probably the real spear tip of psychedelic therapy, is that less about the legality and the research. It's more about how does this become relevant to those who either it doesn't speak to them currently or they don't have the means for it to speak to them. And so I would think the biggest way to do that is to allow and empower others to create their own protocols and ceremonies that speaks in ways that speaks to them, as opposed to me trying to come up with a way or trying to create a playlist that it's more of an encouragement and an invitation to give the tools out there. Just as my friend who's African American who does this hip hop ceremony, I never would have thought about that, and that's fantastic. If that works for them, or there are plenty of people who do ceremonies that they're from Latin America and they like to dance and they like to bring in this rhythm and get sort of in this trance state with the dance. And that's not my wheelhouse either. So I think the short answer is that I think it's important. And if we want these medicines to speak to people in the way that speaks to them, we have to give people the tools and the means to experiment and not tell them, how to do it, but there's nothing wrong with saying this is what works for me. But there's infinite ways to skin the cat, as it were. And I think we have to think of it as a tool. It's like a hammer, you can hit someone over the head or you can build a house. Psychedelics are not a panacea in themselves. It's just what we do with them. So my background is most definitely a suburban white guy who had the means to even experiment with this stuff in life from a middle-class background. And that's definitely what brought me to this place. Absolutely. That's how I was able to even think that I could do any of this. And my dream is that anyone could take those same risks. But I'm interested very much in learning how we can open this up, this kind of work, to anyone. And I would hate for psychedelic therapy. I'm more in the decrim model than or maybe it's a both and, but I wouldn't want to see it be something that's, so expensive that it just becomes another part of our medical model where tons of money is made and maybe some of that's subsidized. And yes, that's still helpful, but I don't feel like that's wholly the answer. I really just want to be about providing tools and information. And I'm looking for that sort of outflow going out into the world, because people are hungry for this. They are experimenting and they are looking for tools and information. And I think we're not going to be able to funnel anyway in one way or the other. And so it's helpful for us to just be able to give people any help we can. I hope that answers your questions.
Yeah, I appreciate that. And I mean, in the clinical settings, it's interesting. And you said your partner is a ketamine therapist. So I'd love to hear the conversations, about how you guys discuss, decisions on playlists for particular patients, or if you decide, if there's certain factors that would lead you to use one playlist over another, including these cultural factors.
Yeah, it's funny because, I have less experience with that, because in mine was always me playing music and I just felt like I don't have the ability to do it. I just do what I do. So it's like people were already showing up knowing I'm going to do an East Forest ceremony. And so actually that never had to cross my consciousness. But for her, that's a really fascinating question. I I think it would be. We happen to be here in Boise, and she's in one of the only ketamine clinics, and probably the only person I know, maybe period, who's doing group ketamine therapy at a time. But this is a very white place too. So it comes up less often probably to have that diversity in the room. It's probably more socioeconomic diversity than cultural and racial, but it's a great point. And I think it is important probably. This would be an interesting thing for people to learn is like, how do I address this with my patients to sort of take a kind of intake about what is your musical background, what does speak to you, what is your intention with this, and how can then you help serve that with the music. It's a great question.
Thanks so much.
We got another question here from Matt. So Matt, you ask your question.
Yeah, great. Thanks so much for this has been really helpful. I'm just curious if you could say a little bit about with your ceremonies and dosage and how that kind of affects people's experience of your music and your experience. And just curious if you could say a little bit about that specific to psilocybin.
Sure. Well, as you know, there's no one dosage for everybody. Some people, 1 gram is somebody else's 5 grams. But I found that in general, if you figure out someone's tolerance, what worked best was sort of this middle of the road where my goal was not to smear their consciousness across the wall and that happens, but that's not the purpose, because I felt like in the ceremonial work where they had an intention, and especially in group work, they're there to do work in essence. They're not there to completely lose themselves and not even remember it. I still think that work is valuable when you don't, it's almost like a dream. I think there's a lot going on the other layers of your mind, but something in the middle where you have to be past the psychedelic threshold for sure, I think, but not so far that you start for the entire experience, perhaps you don't really remember it. And somewhere in the middle ground, similar to what they found with a lot of the Hopkins stuff. I think it was in the 2.5 to 3.5 gram range, but that's very tolerance dependent, and also depends on the kind of psilocybin you have as well and its potency. But I think caution is extremely important, because psychedelic trauma is a real thing, and I'm always more on the boat of like, you could always do this twice and start to learn about your own baseline tolerance, or 3 times and slowly work your way up how you're comfortable. I'm not of the McKenna mindset of beware the underdose, the 5 gram journey. I've heard that parroted to me so many times, and I'm like, I do not agree with that. That's not right for everybody. And you can have just as much meaning and power from not having 5 grams of dried mushrooms. So I've seen beautiful journeys at lower doses, or even, people use my record to have ceremonies with no medicine or breath work, and it's powerful. Or it's a matter of relaxation. There's so many ways to access these parts of our psyche and our hearts. Really, psychedelics are just like a super amplified one. And so I think caution is good.
Great. Yeah, no, I appreciate that. Thank you. I found microdosing has made a huge difference for me in just kind of coming at it, having had experiences a long time ago where I went at it the other way, it just kind of being subtle, having a subtle sort of gentle experience feels more meaningful than trying to do the 5 gram thing.
Yeah. And, you could look at it the other way and say, like, that fear is healthy, but it could be holding you back from particular breakthroughs where you want to find that line where you're not fully in control, because that's when the mind can something else can come through that noise, that level of control that's always there. But it's scary. I get scared too.
Thanks. Appreciate it.
All right, so we want to make sure to save some time at the end. East Forest is going to lead a music and guided meditation. So I think I'll pull one more question out of the chat, and then I think we'll transition to that. So this one comes from George Greer. Have you had the experience or heard of using constantly rhythmic Burning Man type DJ music for individual or group psychedelic sessions? Ona Dahl, Tara Brooks, Yoko, and others have often have music in the style I'm thinking about.
Sure, I've heard of it and I've seen it. It's just not my style. But again, if that works for someone, it works for someone. I can definitely see how those sorts of rhythmic elements are entrancing and training of the brain. I mean, really, if you think about why is four on the floor dance music even popular, to me, it probably has something to do with when we're in the womb. And the first thing that develops on our senses is the ear and hearing. What do you hear? It's a drum beat nonstop until you're born. So it does take us back to the womb. It takes us back to something original. And I didn't mention also about field recordings. Like when you think about white noise, like a sea of crickets, 10,000 crickets or 10,000 frogs, when you really start to meditate to them, indigenous cultures would call them portal openers, because it starts to entrain your brain and it becomes one cricket, and you get these waves, sort of chaos waves happening in there, and it is calming, and it does get you into these trance states. So beats can do that, and I wouldn't doubt that can work for some people. I tend to be more in the direction of calming and finding openings through that sort of less is more, minimalism, silence, beauty, etherealism. I like music that's achingly emotional, but for some people, they need a harder hit. So anything can work. But just remember, whatever works for you doesn't necessarily work for somebody else. And I'm only coming from the place of I was creating music that initially was working for me, but then I had the unique experience of using it and testing it as a tool with many other people and finding those commonalities for people from different backgrounds, different age groups, and who had different intentions through the journey. And I started to find a way to guide all of them musically. And that's just my experience.
Well, thank you. That was a really awesome talk. Really appreciate you taking the time to answer all of our questions. And you want to lead us in this meditation? Everybody, I think headphones, right, are recommended for this. And
Yeah, headphones are good. And then find a place to sit or lie down, whatever feels like you can just relax for about 10 minutes. And
okay, before we get into that, I'll just plug your website. Check it out, eastforth.org, right? And
.org, yeah, and the same thing on the socials and stuff. Or I think it's East Force Music on Facebook, but it's pretty easy to find, and it's on all the music platforms. And the Music for Mushrooms album is anywhere you listen to music. But if you do want it in high fidelity, you can download it from my website in a massive file of 24-bit glory, if you're into that kind of thing. I put it on things like SoundCloud just for accessibility, but it's very low fidelity on those systems, and it makes me cringe to think that people are journeying, even though I'm sure it's fine for them. So East Forest is easy to find.
yeah, support him. Buy the album for your clients. All right, thank you.
Cool. Well, I'll assume everybody's getting comfortable and getting their headphones, and I'm going to play some music in the background that is from the Music for Mushrooms, a soundtrack for the Psychedelic Practitioner album. I'm going to share my sound here. Okay. Colleen, thumbs up if you hear that. Crickets? Great.
The crickets.
All right. You can go ahead and mute yourself just in case. But take a moment to just close your eyes and listen. Breathe in through your nose and out through your mouth at a normal pace. Good. Listening to the crickets, the kalimba. You're breathing in through your nose and out through your mouth at your own pace. I want you to put your attention on the sounds, that synthesizer pad that just came in. all you have to do is just pay attention to the sounds. Breathing in through the nose, out through the mouth. Noticing how you're already calming down. Parasympathetic system, this technology of breath. Simple and always there. Let the music hold the center of your attention as you fall away from it. Notice the elements that build. Call this active listening. This means you put your attention on the different elements. Slow build of the melody. As you're breathing, breathe into your heart, out. You don't have to work too hard, just a normal breath. As the layers continue, begin to notice in your body how you feel. Where is there tension? Where are you holding? Next exhale, release some of that holding. With each exhale, you are releasing and arriving in the now. In through the nose, out through the mouth. Loosening the grip. What is? Just the sweetness of this melody. And that's you. Nowhere to be, nothing to know. Anything you don't need, just let go of it. Exit. In this space, sense the tenderness. That is you. Perfect silence. Perfect breath. What if what you're yearning for is no further away than your next breath? Breathing in, letting go. Just this, just this. Nothing to learn. Nothing to earn. It's already here. With each breath into your heart, you can feel an expansion and a growing sense of ease, depth, knowing. A recognition that that knowing is always there. When it feels right to you, place a hand on your heart and a hand on your stomach. Just breathe into your hand, into your stomach, a cycle of energy through your heart, out to your other hand. And as you listen, what do you hear? Beyond the music. No one else can hear what you hear. No one else knows what you're feeling right now. There's no wrong answer. What wants to speak to you now? That's you. Receive the gift. Plant the seed. Gentle smile on your face. It feels right to you. Bringing that into this world is attention. You dance. Breathing in through your nose, out through your mouth. Always blossoming, always growing. With no destination. Breathe into that feeling. Fill your whole body with it. Plants it in the ground. Let it go. Let it burn away. What wants to burn away so something new can be born? What can you loosen the grip on to allow what is? Just this. There's a recognition this is knowing is always with you. You can always listen. Perhaps you just place your hands on your heart and your stomach when you want. Feeling emerges. Strength emerges. The dance continues. Breathe in through our nose, out through the mouth. Slowly round the corner as we bring ourselves back. Still just this. Two more breaths. Move what needs to move. And when you feel ready, open your eyes and we'll conclude our meditation.
I got a tear.
Well, that's what we aim for, Colleen, is people crying. No, but that thank you for being vulnerable, and it's a reminder that no one knows except you, and giving the gift of that vulnerability is giving it to yourself, by giving it to others. It's a wonderful co-conspiracy of awakening. So it's very simple.
Well, thank you everybody for joining us. We hope you enjoyed that. Thank you, Esporus, for that beautiful conversation and meditation. Hope that you all go out into your evening feeling relaxed and in touch with yourself, and have a good night's sleep, good week. Any parting words you'd like to share with everybody?
Yeah, stay in touch. And I released a meditation and a little meditation album on Spotify. So if you want to do more, you're out there. And there's one called A Meditation for Chaotic Times that I recorded right when COVID hit. And I found it to be nicely grounding, similar to what we just did. And plenty of other offerings out there. So find the way that works for you, and I hope to see you again.
Thanks a lot. I'm going to ask everyone to unmute so they can express their gratitude. But thanks for being here with us. These fours was great.
Thank you.
Really enjoyed it.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Appreciate
Thank
it.
you.
Amazing.
Wonderful.
Absolutely amazing.
You're
Beautiful.
awesome.
Thank you.
All right. Have a good night. Goodbye, everybody.
Adios. Have a good night, everybody.
Thanks for us. We'll
Thank
talk
you,
to you
Yale, for
later.
hosting
Bye.
us.
Thanks again.